So why did you write about the FDA? This is very different than your last book.
It is actually. So I wrote about it for a couple of reasons. The first is that from the moment I left the Avastin hearing, I felt like it was a momentous event, that something important had just happened. And I was frankly surprised that other people hadn't written about it.
Mhm.
This was the very first time that the FDA had approached a manufacturer of a drug that was approved under accelerated approval and said, "We recommend you remove this from the market." And that company said no.
Mhm.
And that's pretty bold. And during the proceedings themselves, of course, we all reflect on, should the drug remain on the market? Should it be removed? And why did the company say no? What was their motivations for doing
Mhm.
so? And in doing so, were they making a drug that was still relevant, available to women who had few other options? Or were they just simply leaving it on the market to reap additional profit before it would forcibly be removed?
Mhm.
So that was one aspect of it. I always felt like this was this momentous point in time for the FDA where their authority to remove a drug was really being questioned at the highest levels and very publicly. This was broadcast on the national news. I mean, even my parents were watching, the NBC nightly news and commented they saw me as the cameras were panning across our panel, right? This was a big deal.
Mhm.
And the FDA knew it would be a big deal and again, very public. The second aspect, Denise, that drove me to write this as this was percolating was that with the appointment of Scott Gottlieb to head the FDA,
Mhm.
he made it very clear that he wanted more drugs available on the market and then let the free market decide which drugs we would use and which we wouldn't.
Mhm.
So there was almost this indication that there would be a changing of the standards to allow drugs on the market so that more doctors and patients could use them and suss through which were really safe and effective drugs for patients and which shouldn't be used. And we saw a tsunami of drugs approved under accelerated approval over the ensuing 5 years.
Mhm.
Well, anyone who's lived through Avastin, as you and I have, know that when that happens, when that many drugs are approved under accelerated approval, you're going to have drugs that are going to have to be pulled from the market
Mhm.
because their so called confirmatory studies didn't confirm their safety and efficacy.
Mhm.
And in fact, so as I'm writing this book, I'm thinking, gee, this is going to happen. It's been about 5 years. That's about the time these trials come in. This is a relevant book for as those drugs are pulled from the market and whether pulling those drugs from the market is the ultimate demonstration of how well the FDA works or in how well it doesn't work.
Mhm.
And sure enough, as you've seen, you live and breathe this every day. We've seen a number of drugs that have been pulled over the past year and a half where the
Mhm.
confirmatory studies didn't confirm.
Mhm. And you did mention at the end of the book about the Alzheimer's drug. Do you think that eventually is going to be removed?
It's a great question. I mean, that was a very controversial approval by the FDA against the advice of an advisory committee. Exactly the same setup as with Avastin,
Mhm.
where the initial advisory committee voted against approving the drug, right? And but with this, it was much more uniform among the advisory committee that the drug shouldn't be approved. The FDA went ahead and did it because, again, you have a desperate patient population with very few options, none of
Mhm.
which work particularly well. So I get the sense they were feeling political pressure and patient advocacy pressure to get a drug approved. Subsequent to that, you had members of that advisory committee who quit in protest.
Mhm.
And subsequent to that, we had the revelation that data were falsified
Oh, wow.
about the receding plaques. So that
Mhm.
one of the controversies around this is that the measures of patient improvement, their day-to-day function, clinical improvement, actually didn't support the drug, but the plaques seemed to recede on the scans. So the FDA felt like that was demonstration of activity. Well, now it turns out that those data were falsified.
Mhm.
So part of the basis of the FDA's approval has now been retracted.
Mhm.
So given all of that, um, is the FDA going to withdraw it? It's hard for me to predict. If I were on the FDA, would I withdraw this drug from approval? Yes.